felt real, I think, comfort and release when he was in nature. And this clearly then influenced his design. And he also was deeply concerned in public parks for all people, as we now take it for granted that there are public parks, but really prior to Olmsted, this was not something that people could take for granted. He went to Birkenhead Park. He saw a public park that was funded by the taxpayers, and he came away saying that this was something where the poorest peasant and the queen could be seen together in the park. And I think it's, again, this idea of bringing people together from all backgrounds to be seen with each other was part and parcel of the philosophy of his work, and to be inclusive. And while we have not really had an opportunity to look at pre and post Civil War, I think you've got to think about Olmsted in that context, because he is dealing with a deeply divided society, and he is finding ways through the landscape, he hopes, to bring people together. He had this notion of communitiveness. I like to say it doesn't roll off one's tongue, but this concept that restorative nature could bring people together to be more civil with each other so that they would listen to each other. And that's what he really wanted to do post-Civil War, to bring everyone together, North and South, whatever background, so that they could move beyond slavery into a functioning republic. And how appropriate it was that he was the first landscape architect for the Capitol grounds, because there he was designing the landscape around the people's house. And so that too was a key assignment that he had. How could he create a landscape for all people to come to the people's house? So these were things that were very much front and center to Olmsted in the late 19th century. And I think in many respects, we are in a society today that's deeply divided. We see inequities. And so I think eerily there are many parallels to the context in which Olmsted was operating. And so I think this panel today will talk about that. And I am just delighted to turn it over to Rebecca Stoner, who is the executive director of the Milwaukee Parks Foundation. We're delighted to have Dr. Keller from Marquette, who will talk to us about health aspects. John Schmid, journalist, who will talk to us about trauma and his research that he's doing. And then Tony Giron, who is from the Parks Department, who will talk again about community engagement and inclusiveness in the park system. So with that, Rebecca, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for having us. I get the honor today of learning from these wonderful people and not having to talk too much. So I wanted to start us off by looking at the big picture of Milwaukee County and Milwaukee County parks. So County Executive Crowley's mission for Milwaukee County is to achieve racial equity and drive change to become the healthiest county in Wisconsin. And he's a regular champion of this work. So at the Milwaukee Parks Foundation, we've partnered with him on a series of events called the Healthy County Challenge, where we work to get residents out and as residents active in their parks. And we know, evidence shows it, our life experience shows it, that spending time in nature is a powerful strategy for improved physical and mental health. So we also know that access to safe and vibrant parks in Milwaukee County is inequitable. So we don't all, depending on where you live in Milwaukee County, you may have access to a safe and vibrant park or you may not. So this is a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today, the intersections of health, equity, and green spaces. And so with that, I would love to kick the first question over to you, Dr. Keller. As an expert in this space, could you just share some of the research and some of the work you've done in the social determinants of health that shares the link between public health and equity and parks?
Thank you. Is this on? Can you all hear me? Okay. Great. So thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. So a little bit about how I view the world and how that guides the work that I do. So my research is aimed at protecting and promoting the health of African American women and their families. And the lens that I use to think about health is one that I'm so happy that the federal government has finally adopted, is around the social determinants of health. And so what that says is that we recognize the role that the healthcare system and direct patient care has in producing health and maintaining health. However, we recognize that it's a small part of that, and actually other things such as social and community context, neighborhood and built environment, education, and economic stability are actually bigger drivers of health. So in thinking about that, I use my time to work with local communities to identify what they want to do and think about what strategies and interventions can we design, implement, and evaluate as a way of promoting the health of all residents by leveraging community assets. And parks are one of the biggest community assets that communities have, whether the park is in their own community or adjacent to their community. It sounds like it. Okay. Is it working now?
No. All right, sorry.
That's okay. We're shifting. So in thinking about the work that we know, so I think one of the great things that I'm as we continue this conversation, that's important to recognize is that the nation's health plan is Healthy People 2030, and it explicitly calls for building a healthier future for all. And part of those, the leading indicator objectives, a lot of them have to do with things that relate to being outdoors, whether it's about decreasing exposure to air pollution or actually physical activity. And so the evidence, as we started this, the evidence is there that parks are important. I don't have to tell you guys this. You know this. But there's evidence that supports it. And so what we have to think about is, how is our response to parks as a resource going to be different in terms of what is a response that is aimed at achieving equality versus one that's aimed at achieving equity. So I will stop right there and let the rest of the panelists weigh in.
Thanks, Dr. Keller. And John, we'd love to hear from you. I know you're doing a lot of research in this space. I'd love to hear a little bit more about Olmsted and some of his health equity ambitions and challenges and how that interacts with his parks.
Gladly. Hi, I'm here today because Dee Dee learned that I'm writing a book, and a chapter of which involves Olmsted and my perspective on Olmsted, and a different and a kind of unique perspective on Olmsted, one that you don't see in the coffee table book versions of Olmsted. And it goes directly to the idea of public health, and it's why Olmsted was ahead of his time and why Olmsted was a genius, and Dee Dee said you have to talk about all that in 5 minutes. So I said, okay, Dee Dee, I'll take your challenge. And I prepared remarks, so I'll just read right through them, and they're meant to keep me really tightly focused. But I will need to start talking quite quickly. So I'm a journalist, and I came to study Olmsted's work through my reporting on the mental health crisis that is currently ravaging the whole nation, particularly the youthful generation. And about 6 years ago, I need to tell you, I started to immerse myself in a new school of public health research, a unique group of scientists who in the last quarter century have figured out how to do something that nobody else actually thought you could do, which is to measure the scope and scale of neurological trauma within communities or cities or nations. In shorthand, how much PTSD is active within a population? It's the sort of statistic that was presumed by everybody to be unknowable, because how could it be? It's something that only a therapist could know, and then only after a bunch of sessions, right? But I will avoid the wonkishness on the topic of these data points, these metrics. We don't have time, except to say that these studies exist. They're pretty advanced, pretty far along. Some of them can almost read trauma metrics within a community like an unemployment rate within a community. They're credible, they're taken seriously. And I began to write stories about an idea that had taken me by surprise, but it's actually pretty well validated. And that is that Milwaukee and Wisconsin and the United States live in an era that's defined by collective psychological traumatization on a scale that's nothing short of another pandemic. I'm speaking of the scars that are invisible, of course, but these metrics explained to me a great deal about contemporary America and the sort of environment in which we're talking about parks. They explain, for instance, the current crisis of mental health. They explain generational cycles of poverty. I'm looking at Dr. Keller, nod her head. They explain chronic unemployment, addiction and overdoses. They explain violence that begets violence, jail and suicide. And apropos public health, there's an expression in the field that there is no health without mental health. So I don't need to explain how this involves smoking and heart disease and anxiety and so on. It's unhealthy. And precisely none of this would have been news to Olmsted. In the shortest way of explaining it, there are 3 categories of traumatic experiences that are proven to inflict mental injury. And Olmsted checked every single box, each several times over. The first such capital T trauma, typically we call battlefield trauma or combat trauma, what was once called Vietnam syndrome. Olmsted witnessed combat trauma. Anyone who knows about those floating hospitals or those tents know that he was present when soldiers were bleeding to death in front of him. Enough said on that. The second form of trauma, mass trauma that exists today, is racist trauma. We live in the age of George Floyd, but as white as he was, Olmsted was a journalist who reported what amounts to the origin story of white supremacy. That's what he was doing in those southern states. That's what he was doing in the Cotton Kingdom. And he did so in newspaper narratives that are so vivid that I was shaken to read them. It should suffice just to quote what Malcolm X said of these writings. This book opened my eyes to the horrors suffered when the slave was landed in the United States. That's a strong endorsement of Olmsted's understanding of racist trauma. But most of all, Olmsted was a clear-cut case of the third kind of major trauma, which is called childhood trauma. At age 3, as many people know, in his own home, Frederick witnessed his mother die of an opioid overdose. I mean, I'm sorry, this is why it's hard to compress these things into 5 minutes, because you cannot trivialize what that means to a person, or what that meant to Fred Olmsted. In those days, it was called laudanum, and was unlicensed, and overprescribed, if that sounds familiar to anybody, and fully addictive, and the experience never left him. And from there, at a very young age, Frederick was abandoned by his new stepmother and sent to a series of boarding schools which were known to inflict physical punishment. His childhood was one of leaving home and being left with strangers. And so there's a consensus, not surprisingly, that Olmsted would have qualified for a formal diagnosis of complex PTSD, and he lived with that. He understood the pain of a mental health crisis because he was a living example of it. He had wild swings of depression and was almost certainly, as noted previously, bipolar. Famously, you'll find this in all the biographies, he locked himself into dark rooms for days at a time. And he either worked feverishly and manically and without sleep, or he had these crippling depression bouts. That's well documented. And so it was these internal scars, which Olmsted carried, that motivated him to drop everything in the middle of his life, in the middle of his career. He was a publisher, he was a best-selling author. He dropped all of that, and he said, I'm just going to make parks. Because he understood something that was, as Dee Dee said, well ahead of his time. People can and do heal when given the chance. Olmsted understood that the first steps always begin with the most basic precondition, without which there can be no recovery, and that is a safe space. Everyone I've spoken to, I can't read the sign, but I'm finishing. Everyone I've spoken to who's involved in the recovery process agrees that the turning point toward healing and the first steps to recovery do not and never begin in the same environment that inflicts the mental chaos in the first place. And when people are at their breaking point, Olmsted understood, they need a place that offers sanctuary. He created Rapture. He perfected all those cool optical tricks that Patrick Mullins talked about, all those special effects in the spatial fields of vision, just to lure people almost unconsciously, unwittingly, into these places. That's what he was all about. These parks exist because of one man's mental health crisis in another era that has many parallels to our own, and that's why the magical experience of an Olmsted Park is more essential than ever to public health. This one works.
Thank you so much for that, John. I often say in this work that the stakes in our parks are really high. You know, I think some people think about parks, and rightfully so, think about green space and slides and playgrounds and all the wonderful amenities, but all of the challenges that we're facing today play out in our parks. And I think you just expressed that so beautifully, John. Let's all take a deep breath, because I think what we're talking about today is really heavy, and I just want to acknowledge that's real. I've had the honor of working with Tony in his role at Milwaukee County Parks. And Tony, one thing I love about you is how community-centric you are and how you love hearing from residents and you love hearing from people. Could you just share with us a little bit about what you're hearing from residents about the challenges and opportunities in our parks with respect to health and health equity?
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca. So speaking from experience working as the community engagement manager at parks, I'll just start by saying that our park system is inequitable. They're a direct reflection of the neighborhoods that Milwaukee has. There's tons of segregation going on, and a lot of that is compounded by how we invest in our parks. So we have a really great system of team of friends. We have different groups of friends that shepherd and take care after each park, almost all parks. We have over 150 parks and just over 50 friends groups. So we're working on getting more friends groups because they really are the lifeblood of our parks and provide the eyes, ears, and hands, and a lot of resources. So as you can imagine, friends groups that are in parks that are in wealthier neighborhoods have a greater fundraising ability. The park we're in right now, for example, Lake Park, we could not have rebuilt Ravine Road, or the Ravine Bridge right behind me, if it weren't for the help of Lake Park Friends and all of the support that they received. So recently, me and my team went out and knocked on doors for a project at Mitchell Park. You may have heard about the future of Mitchell Park, including the domes. If you're local, you know that they're in trouble. It's going to cost over $60 million for any solution, really, rebuild them, redo them, or we have like 4 different options, but I won't go through those. But we were asking the neighbors, what do they value most about Mitchell Park and the domes? And the survey that we were doing really did focus on the domes, but most neighbors would pivot their response and say, yeah, I love the domes. It'd be great if they stayed, but I really love Mitchell Park. I love walking through it, and I would love it even more if it was a little bit safer. We do have homeless and drug use going on in that park. That's a much bigger issue than I think Milwaukee County Parks can handle. But I think so there's the Friends of the Domes. They do an amazing job of having educational programming and then also bringing kids out into Mitchell Park. But they haven't invested anything into Mitchell Park itself. All of their investment is within the domes. So maybe someday they will become the Friends of Mitchell Park after everything is settled down with the domes. But for now, we're not seeing much investment in Mitchell Park. So far, we've started growing our Friends group system. We in my time here, 2 years, we've started 8 new Friends groups, and 6 out of 8 of those are in low-income areas. And there's lots of issues going on, and people come to me talking about, we need more dog parks, we need more, we need to open more pools. You know, parks have a lot of problems. We're very behind. We used to have 1,200 full-time employees in the early 80s, and we are over, we have about 200 something right now. So yes, we are very understaffed and would love to solve all of those issues, but we don't have as many resources, and we really do lean on our friends and would hope that they would help us with more of our maintenance issues, which are the greatest need right now. But yeah, kick it back to you, Becky.
Thanks so much, Tony. That's actually a perfect segue into another question I had. So panelists, if you don't mind, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. One of my least favorite statistics that I've learned about Milwaukee County Parks is that today each county parks employee is responsible for managing about 28 Lambeau fields worth of land. So I don't do the mowing in my house, but I've been to Lambeau Field, and I can imagine what that would be like. And I'm learning about Olmsted and excited to learn more about him. And I know that he viewed parks as essential infrastructure for livable cities. And we don't see that same kind of prioritization today. And so I'd love to ask each of our panelists in just a couple of minutes, could you share, you know, Tony talked about the Friends groups. I work at the Milwaukee Parks Foundation. There's a lot of incredible partners working to leverage resources and to make our parks more vibrant, more equitable. Could you all share some advice on what you would do to leverage funding or partnerships or anything really to build a healthier, more equitable park system? And actually, Tony, maybe we'll start with you this time and come back this way.
Sure. So I can speak to what Parks is doing right now to make parks safer. So we've doubled our park ranger team. Over the past couple of years, we used to have 4 or 5. Now we have up to 10, which is not nearly enough for our over 150 parks, but it does help tremendously considering that our rangers are unarmed, unlike the police, and they use their words to, what's the word? De-escalate, thank you. De-escalate different situations. But of course, then they will call the police if it calls for it. I believe that Olmsted inspired Whitnell, who is our first park commissioner, to lock down a lot of our green space throughout the county and provide geographical access to people all over the county. Everybody lives at least within a mile of a park, and that's fantastic, but they may not feel quite as safe or comfortable going to parks that are not as well maintained. And in terms of access, physical access, we have amazing partners that are like the Ability Center. They are housed within one of our parks, and they also do things like the Moby Mat, which allows people in wheelchairs to be able to access the water at Bradford Beach. They have also successfully fundraised to rebuild Wisconsin Avenue Park to make it into the nation's most accessible park. It'll be called Moss Universal. And I think what they're doing is amazing. And then our own planning team who designs playgrounds are making sure that all of our playgrounds are as accessible as possible.
I love the question of partnerships. Some can be disastrous, by the way. Trump's name used to be in Central Park on a partnership. But I want to talk about, I love the question of partnerships because when I think of Olmsted and when I think of partnerships, I think of something that is called, well, back to the idea of mental health. In Boston, for those who are in Boston, they'll know this, Olmsted created one of his dedicated mental health campus and hospitals called McLean. It was actually it was a forerunner to the idea of a partnership that you can use this green space for healing. How powerful is a McLean? How powerful is an Olmsted partnership? McLean shows it. To this day, McLean still exists. To this day, McLean is considered the premier mental health research hospital in the nation. I have to think that that's got something to do with the fact that it was birthed in this green space that Olmsted created. As I do my research on trauma statistics and mental health statistics, a lot of them come from the researchers at McLean, which in turn is owned by something called the Harvard Medical School. It's not trivial. It's how huge the potential is that this can be. And many people either know, if you're in the field, you know McLean for its research. If you're not in the field, if you're just like an English major, you know McLean because it was almost a revolving door of very well-known artists and writers and poets who helped keep the name prominent. Sylvia Plath, Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, the woman who wrote Girl Interrupted, James Taylor. It's a really long list. And I just want to put that out there as an example of, and it's because they didn't destroy the green space that they made it what it is.
Okay, this is working now. So I reflect on this idea of partnerships. We had one of our, I think, great community leaders who was poached from Milwaukee to go somewhere else. We're not bitter about it at all. But he used to always say that there is the power of the partnerships. And so, sorry. Clearly doesn't want me to talk. One of the community groups that I work with, it's really leaned into this in terms of leveraging the partnerships with their anchor institutions. So we think about what are the organizations that they're just too big to move. So I work at Marquette University. We are an anchor in Avenues West. We are not moving our campus. We are tied to that community until our university closes. There's other large brands that you would recognize that are also in that neighborhood or near us. Those are also anchors. So they have a vested interest in that space. So that's one of the partnerships that we've leveraged in terms of both thinking about revitalizing our commercial corridor, but then also leveraging that into creating a healthy community and thinking about how do we sustain the assets that are currently here. And so thinking about partnerships, I think that's a unique way to think about it. Who has a vested interest? But then also the way that we've approached these partners is thinking about how do we make a business case for what it is that we want or we feel that the residents need and deserve? How do we talk about it in a way that resonates with that institution? So one of our institutions, we have a healthcare facility. So we can talk about here are the health outcomes for the residents and that's what they care about. You can go talk to the president of Marquette University and be like, well, he actually is very interested in mental health as an off note. But, it's hard to say, but we can talk about this is what the experience is for our students who live in this area. This is the opportunities that exist for our students to go out in the community and practice what we are teaching them, because that's our job as training. And so I think that partnerships can be successful, but it has to be bidirectional and it has to be mutually beneficial. And so that, I think, is where there's a lot of opportunity for being innovative about who is a stakeholder and has a vested interest in the area around these green spaces.
Thank you all. I'm definitely taking notes for our work. We know that parks are good for our health. We've talked about that a lot. Obviously, we only reap the benefits of our healthy parks when we're able to go to them, when we feel safe, when we feel a sense of ownership or maybe belonging in our parks. Panelists, I'd love to hear from each of you. How do you think we can promote this sense of belonging and welcomeness, if that's a word? If not, I just invented it, in our parks so that more people feel safe and free to visit them? And anyone can take this one.
So we all know parks are a public amenity and they should be reflecting the wants and needs of the people that live around them. Lake Park here, as a great example, we have baseball and soccer, which is pretty par for the course for lots of other parks, but there's also tennis and golf and lawn bowling, which I have yet to do, but I really want to try. And what else do we have? One of the nicest playgrounds in the system. And we also received a request to have pickleball here in Lake Park. Not only in Lake Park, we get that request for so many other parks across the system. It's, a very popular sport. We couldn't do it here, unfortunately. They wanted to put turn part of the tennis court into pickleball, at least temporarily, but there's enough tennis use here that we didn't want any conflict between the tennis players and pickleball players. That and the proposal call to store the nets inside of the Lake Park Friends building, which if you're not a friend of the Friends, then you might not have as equitable of access. Milwaukee County Parks also has other recreational activities like softball, golf, open gym, swimming lessons. Our marketing team does as good of a job as they can to have an online presence to promote those, but not everybody's online, right? So my team, we do community engagement out at different parks, but also we are focusing outside of parks. We go to events like Mexican Fiesta and 3vs3 basketball tournaments, Juneteenth Day, and we do general outreach, which involves looking at park maps, finding where what the nearest park is to where you live, and then what sorts of activities can you get involved in at each park. So we're growing the engagement team. I've been able to hire a couple seasonals each year, but our golf cart lease came in lower this year, so they're able to afford a few more community engagement staff for me. So I'll have 3 full-timers next year.
So, I think about this, and not just with parks, but with everything we do in community engaged research and community organizing. I think, we were all socialized to think about things in terms of if you build it, they will come. And that's actually not true. If we build it, we will come. And so that's something that we think about in terms of, thinking about funding proposals that are coming from the National Institutes of Health. I'm really excited to see them asking for co-creation of interventions, co-creation of different things. So the idea that the end user needs to be a part of the process from the very beginning. Don't bring them in at the end and say, okay, give us your stamp of approval on what we've already designed for you. But what is it? What is a problem? And that's one of the things in doing community engaged research that I always have to remind myself. I know in the neighborhoods I work with that intimate partner violence and domestic violence is one of our number one public health issues. But when I ask the groups I work with, that never rises to the top. And that's okay, right? So I need to be present for what is it that you think, that you feel you need, because you are the expert on you and your community. And then over time, as we address, because this is all about building trust. And so, right now it's like, okay, well, we really need somewhere, and ironically, we need somewhere for kids to play. I got you. All right. Let's think about what assets do we have. Some of you were at Washington Park yesterday, so that's our neighbor. And so thinking about, okay, so Washington Park is there, but what's the reality of access, but also what is the perceived access? So the reality of access is, you saw the traffic patterns around Washington Park. We're not going to send our kids across those roads. That's just the truth of it. So we need to address that. But even if we did that, one of the things we know is kids don't see themselves in parks. So how do we start to change that narrative? And one of the things that we've talked about is working with our schools who already have the kids with them. What do you all like to do? I like to make hip hop videos. I'm doing my podcast. I want to be a fashion designer. Okay. Let's think about how we do those things in the parks. Because if we can get them there to do the things they want to do, then they're like, what's that person doing over there? Oh, that's tennis. Do you want to learn how to play tennis? I could do that. All right, let's go. So I think it's about changing the narrative and really thinking about what can we build together. And that's a hard thing because we all have people that we have to answer to. We have limited budgets. But I think that if we can get to a place where people feel like they were listened to, they were heard, and there was action taken, it just builds momentum. And so I think in terms of trying to get more people in the parks, we have to build it together and build the next iteration together.
Right. If you have more people in the parks, you're going to feel safe, and the parks are useless if you don't feel safe. I began my reporting career in Chicago, and for about 2 years, I was covering something called the Chicago Park District, which used to, at that time, look up to Milwaukee as someone who knew how to do it. Because at that time, Harold Washington, the mayor of Chicago at the time, was bringing in these reformers. He got elected with the limousine liberals on the lakefront, and they all said, could you please help restore these Olmsted parks that we have here in Chicago? We've had enough field houses tearing down the trees, filling in the ravines. The debate in Chicago at that time was, we're going to have full access at the cost of the aesthetics of the park. So when you talk, Becky, about the welcomeness, which is a nice word, I think that Olmsted took care of that himself. He made them inviting. He made them, like Patrick said, you want to walk into this 19th century Arcadian landscape painting. Don't take that away if you want people to come into them. Don't rip down and not too many pickleball courts, please.
My parents are avid pickleball players, so I'm going to plead the fifth on that one. No. Well, I just want to ask one more question, and then we'll open it to the audience for questions. At the Milwaukee Parks Foundation, we talk a lot about building the movement for parks and how we're just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And I don't feel like I know there is so much passion and expertise in this room today. If you all had to give some advice to our folks in the audience, what would you say somebody could do today or tomorrow to continue building the movement for parks and parks as the epicenter of health equity in Milwaukee? And apologies, I'm going a little bit rogue. This one isn't in the script, so.
I think, first and foremost, I think it's listen, right? So I think the best strategies come from the people who know the problem intimately. And so there's nothing that will be sustainable and successful if the end users aren't involved in the process. So I think just sitting with identifying, I think we do a good job of identifying who's using the parks. So then I think it's a reflection moment of who's not here that should be, and where are they now? And how do we go to them and ask them? Because is it that they don't know about the parks? Okay, how do we address that? Is it we know, but I don't feel like it's for me? Well, how can we show you that it's for you? So we don't even understand what the problem is. We've made assumptions about what the problem is, and you know what they say about assuming. So I think it really starts with listening, and then once we have a good sense of what is the issue, then it's leaning into partnerships, right? There's a limited resources, but how can we pull together partners to identify a shared vision of what this could be and how we know that if we have thriving parks, it will make our communities healthier and it will make our communities stronger. So it becomes leveraging partnerships, creating a shared vision, and then having a plan. How do we communicate that vision in a way that resonates with different stakeholders?
So that reminds me of some of the community engagement work that we do at parks. So, thanks for that. One of my favorite ways to engage people is going door to door, not only because you get to meet friendly people who love their parks, but also because I think it's the best way to get people, get the real true opinion of a community unfiltered without just listening to the same people who are very plugged into a lot of the work that we already do. So there's this trail conversion project that we have going on over at Lincoln Creek, and we went door to door asking people, how would you feel if your street was converted into a trail? And then, try to get their response immediately. Most people were very positive about it, but we were hearing from some squeaky wheels that were very opposed to the project. And they were 10 people versus the neighborhood where we knocked doors were like 200 people with 90% in favor. There was 3 people who were opposed, and the rest were neutral. So yeah, but the biggest part of my job is collecting public input for our capital improvement projects, and we do have a big online presence, which is great. We have our Engagement HQ website that has all of our projects, and we encourage people to engage with us by, we have a guest book feature, we have surveys, but like I said, only people who are plugged in to our world know what's going on. So we take those same surveys and bring them to the public.
It's hard to add anything meaningful to what the people on either side of me said or what the people said earlier at this conference today. This country is so divided. It's nice to have one place where people can come together. Sometimes it's Lambeau Field, but it should be other places as well. And one of the things that I'm going to take home from this conference that I really am thinking a lot about is someone said that Central Park was the greatest work of art of the 19th century. And someone else said, you should appreciate these things like great masterpieces of art, like the living embodiment of something like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. I don't know how else to say it except to underline that there's got to be some way to appreciate these places so that they can do what they were meant for the next generations going forward. Olmsted wanted them for many generations going forward.
Thank you all so much. So I heard we're going to listen, we're going to go door to door and talk with our neighbors about our parks. We're going to partner. We need somebody to work on a rebrand for parks as art, masterpieces. I love that. We know that parks are art. We know that parks are healthcare. We know that parks are community. And we know that you all are already a part of the movement for parks. So I would love to hear if there's any questions from the audience. Yeah, one in the back.
It's a statement and a question. This has been a really great session, and Dr. Keller and Mr. Schmid, your social determinants of health is revolutionary. I work in housing. We got introduced to it there. And I mention it because I remember an emergency room nurse said what she needed more was not emergency rooms, but more affordable housing. And I think, Mr. Smith, what you said is we need more parks. But here's the challenge, panel. Yesterday we heard the Deputy Park Commissioner say that the parks revenue has not increased in 48 years. He said 1975, but I want to put it in a different context. 48 years. That's the age of my baby girl who will turn 50 in 2 years. 2, the Republican who controlled the state legislature just invested $500 million in housing. And they did it because it finally got through that affordable housing was a way to deal with mental health. And my view is it must be really bad in those Republican districts where Republicans spend $500 million of tax dollars to produce housing. So, you guys talked about the issue of race and segregation, but you didn't put it in the right context. We're in a third world environment. This is now a black city and what comes with it. And within it, you describe those places where people have more class, who are getting benefits that the rest of us can't get. That is not democratic. That is basically no different than Rwanda or Russia. That is not democratic in any form. So my question is, when will the county do what it just did to protect its revenue, first time that occurred, the success, and go after the $8 billion of surplus sitting in the state coffers that could solve these problems? Instead of the work we're doing, and the work you described is important, but it is not going to change that fundamental issue. So what will it take to take all this work of mobilizing people to focus upon getting the resources that will save our park systems? Because I think it would be reasonable for me to say that we are slowly destroying our parks by the lack of resources necessary to maintain them. Yesterday, when I saw the lagoon in Washington Park, I could have cried. It was horrible. It was the greatest desperation I've seen of Olmsted's work in this country. And it's normal. People didn't even see it as a problem. That's what a third world is, that it's so bad that you can't even, you just don't feel it because it's just so bad. The only way we're going to solve that is, how are we going to access that $8 billion? And that's my question. What will it take to get the resources necessary to shame our leaders to take care of its people, which is its constitutional responsibility, is to take care of citizens?
Thank you for your comments, because those are words that needed to be said. And I will say, what is it going to take? Vote. That is the only power that we have. And I think as community organizers and people who care about community assets, it's educating. And it's so, here's the thing. There are no unintended consequences. There are no unintended consequences. The system that we have has been created for a reason. And if we want to change it, we have to change the leadership. And it's going to be hard because everything that has been designed is to maintain the status quo. And so if we're going to change it, because I can appreciate that the difficulty, we can talk about going to the parks, and this is something we didn't talk about. The lived experience of people in the city of Milwaukee is, I'd love to go to the parks, but I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight. I don't know where my food is coming from. I don't know if my kid is actually learning how to read. So yeah, I'd love to go to the parks, but I got to figure out life first. So we actually, if we care about the parks, we have to mobilize our communities to vote. And to vote, and especially because as more and more policies are changing and who the perceived access to voting versus the reality of access to voting, that's a whole nother panel. But we have to re-engage communities and having them understand that the actual power that they have is by voting, not in the national elections. Local elections matter. And that is the message that I think we have to continue to bring into community. Your local election matters. That's great that you come out every 4 years and you're voting for the president, but they are not deciding your day-to-day life. Local elections matter.
Can I add to that? Yes, I agree. That we actually had a referendum to vote to bring more funding to parks, but state legislators didn't listen. We should be playing fire with fire and lobbying as much as we can. I mean, the Brewers spend millions of dollars lobbying, and look, they're about to fund a new stadium, and that's going through. I mean, we could be lobbying better and educating people more. I think that's a big help, because sometimes I still talk to people that are like, why don't we have this? Why don't we have that? It's like, this is our situation. They're like, oh, wow, I had no idea. So yeah, we're not getting our fair share, and we vote blue here, but that's not, sorry, but I don't, yeah, the rest of the state doesn't, so that doesn't really help us here. One thing we're doing at Parks is we created an equity index. So that it scores each park based on a set of criteria, and that is how we determine where we do projects, where we replace playgrounds. Sure, it's nuanced. Sometimes we need an emergency repair. Everything seems to be emergencies these days at parks, but that's how we focus our engagement, and that's how we focus where to put our dollars.
Tony, I'm glad you brought up the equity index. I just want to add one thing. So this is a national model that I think it's really impressive that Milwaukee County Parks is doing this, because there's voting and lobbying for more resources, and there's how do we equitably distribute the resources that we have. And I think that's a conversation that is harder to have, because a lot of people who look like me, white people, people with power and resources, we have to start thinking about the parks as a system. And we have to look at the parks as a system and not just the parks close to us or the parks that we love, which are still important. They're still an important part of that system. So, John, did you want to add something? If not, we can take another question.
This isn't a question. I just want to thank this gentleman right here and all of the parks people who have come, because they're in some sense perceived as in the hot seat. And I think this gentleman here and the gentleman we heard the other day, they love these parks. They're invested in the parks and the communities, and they're between a rock and a hard place. They know what needs to be done. They want to do what needs to be done, but they just don't have the resources. And I think God bless this gentleman right here and all the other guys from the park system that came. And I think we should give them a round of applause.
I saw a question in the back. Yeah.
So, I love the idea of raising more money, allocating resources, but I want to know what is the focus, or is there any attempt to actually make parks be a mandated service? Like, where's the lobbying efforts for that? If there's all of this evidence that it is necessary, crucial to everyone's survival, why are they still optional? And who's lobbying to get them off the optional list?
So I think that what is happening, at least from my perspective in terms of, the communities I work with, is that the idea of parks has become synonymous with green space. And they're not necessarily the same thing. And so I think that's one thing, is clarifying when we say park, what is a park? What are the essential elements of a park, and how is that different from having green space in the in a neighborhood? So I think that's probably the first thing, that, at least in terms of what I'm seeing in the work that I do. But I will defer to my colleagues who know the nuts and bolts better than I do.
I don't have the answer to that question. I was kind of hoping that Rebecca might.
I was going to say the answer to your question is that we don't have lobbyists for parks. I think we have an ally in County Executive Crowley and in Mayor Johnson who have done what they can to increase shared revenue and put the sales tax plan in, which also has a lot of problematic components wrapped into it. And so we are avoiding a fiscal cliff, which is really, really great. But I think what the gentleman back there said, slow death is still a death. So just because we're avoiding a fiscal cliff doesn't mean we're all of a sudden, going to see a ton of revenue come into our parks. But I think, so I can only speak for the Milwaukee Parks Foundation. We're partnering with a lot of people, and we're trying to do what we can to advocate for more sustainable funding solutions for parks. Because we know philanthropy can't solve everything. It's a great and powerful tool for leverage, but it's not the end all be all. Yeah, one last question.
A couple of years ago, there was a senator from Milwaukee who proposed, it was a 1.5% sales tax would be devoted to parks. Missouri has done that. I lived in Missouri in 1970 and 71. Their parks were terrible. Their outhouses were painted black, if you can believe that. So when you went in, you couldn't see the spiders. I was back about 5 years ago. That change of adding a 1.5% sales tax has made all the difference. They have wonderful parks now, so I highly recommend going to Missouri and seeing their parks. That would help, but we have such a long way to go to get that through our legislature because we don't have all the right people there. I think we made a step this spring with that Supreme Court. We're beginning the election there. There is an awful lot of work to do. I'm also going to give you a warning that I've been told by reliable sources that the Noel Stewardship Fund, which we all use at various times for funding for our parks, is in big trouble. And it may not survive as we know it or survive at all as it comes up for renewal in, we just went through a budget, so it'll be 25 when it comes up again. So lobbying, as we all talked about, getting into your groups, voting, all of those things are going to be really necessary. And yeah, Milwaukee votes blue, Madison votes blue, and then there is the rest of the state. But at least you've made a difference with the Protasiewicz election. And hopefully that will begin to generate some differences throughout the state, because it is a troubling situation. I completely agree. And, hopefully they'll all succeed. Thank you.
Just to piggyback on that, I think parks are in a unique situation because everyone benefits from parks. And so I think part of what we're in the health equity work is really thinking about what is a benefit for everyone, right? So I had a colleague who, and I don't know if this is a true story, but this is what she told me, was about on curbs, how there's the curb has to go down to the street level, that was that was for veterans coming back, and that there was a lot of resistance to doing that. But now the value, it benefits everyone. So I think that is a take-home message about parks. They benefit everyone. And now you can't put in a sidewalk without having that curb, whatever they call it thing. The curb cut, that's it. But I think that is, again, making the business case and communicating the business case in a way that resonates with your stakeholders. And that is going to be different for different stakeholders. But parks benefit everyone, and really thinking about, so the rest of the state votes red. We got to figure out how to reach them. That's just the end of it. We got to figure out how to reach them.
All right, I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists. I learned so much from you all. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for having us.
And I want to, absolutely, I want to say thank you too. This was just a powerful, powerful discussion. And it brings back to me Mr. Olmsted, whom I like to think of as a small d Democrat. He was essentially thinking about public spaces, democratic spaces, how we come together. And he was very vitally engaged in the political process. He appeared on a presidential ticket at one point. He engaged very effectively with municipal leaders, whether we're talking about Buffalo or Rochester or other places. He believed in public responsibility and the public obligation to support these public spaces. And we talked a little earlier about the 1865 Yosemite Report, where he talks again about the public responsibility to create national parks for all people. And he did not shy away with talking about that responsibility. So I think this conversation in many respects is one that Olmsted would have loved and would have seconded. And I just want to thank everybody. And I want to second our kudos to the Parks Department and all those who are working to support these places, which we love and which we want to support in every way possible. So that then leads us into the park. We are going to go out into the park for another tour this afternoon. What we will do is we will go around Lake Park, then the shuttle, those of you who are on the shuttle will get on the shuttle, we'll drive down Newbury Boulevard so you can see the connection that Olmsted intended, taking us to Riverside. For those of you who are in your cars, we do have a little instruction sheet that will tell you how to go down Newbury Boulevard. It's not hard, but we have a little instruction sheet so that you can follow the shuttle and then also see part of Riverside. And then tonight, we will meet up at the Groman Museum for our awards ceremony to honor great Olmsted champions. So again, a great day. Thank you to everyone who's participated. Thank you also to Leslie Jacobs back in the back, who has been instrumental from the Olmsted Network. Kathy Keene, who's just been remarkable in every way, and Anna Marie Hawkins, who's pitched in so many times as well. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy your tour in the park. We'll divide up into two groups and go forth.